Aloha from the East-West Center in Honolulu, and mahalo to viewers around the world for tuning into today's webinar, presented by the East-West Center Seminars Live and the East-West Center in Washington. Asia Perspectives on Future Relations as America Votes. Our bi-monthly East-West Seminars Live series is designed for multinational journalists and inform their audiences to connect, inform, and source media stories. My name is Marilyn Lee, a program coordinator at the East-West Center here. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce today's panel prominent academic and journalists sharing their expertise, insights, and perspectives on U.S.-Asia policy and the 2020 election. Dr. Bob Sutter is Professor of Practice of International Affairs at the Elliott School of George Washington University in Washington, D.C. Mr. Nimao Ghosh is the U.S. Bureau Chief of the Straits Times in Washington, D.C. Nimao is an EWC media alum, participated in the 2015 Jefferson Fellowship and the 2016 U.S. Presidential Election Reporting Seminars. Ms. Sanitra Chowdhury is National Political Editor at the Hindustan Times in New Delhi, India. Sanitra is also an East-West Center media alum who participated in the 2018 Jefferson Fellowships. Mr. Anthony Kun is National Public Radio's correspondent based in Seoul, South Korea. He reports on the Korean Peninsula, Japan, and the great diversity of Asia's countries and cultures. Finally, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Satu Limay, Vice President at the East-West Center and the Director of the East-West Center in Washington, where he created and now directs the Asia Matters for America initiative and edits the Asia Pacific Bulletin. Their full bios are on our website, eastwestcenter.org/EWC Seminars Live. I would like to take a moment now to share our webinar protocols. Today's webinar is on the record, recorded live on Zoom, and made available on YouTube for viewing and sharing. Viewers, your microphones and videos are turned off. Each panelist will present his or her perspective in response to moderator-driven questions. Q&A will take place after panelists' interactive discussion. To submit a question, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen and specify if there is a particular panelist you wish to answer. We will address as many questions as time allows. Join the conversation on Twitter using hashtag EWC Seminars Live and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at EWC Seminars. Check our website for webinar information, registration, full speakers bios, and YouTube links at eastwestcenter.org/EWC Seminars Live. From there, you can also access information about other professional opportunities as the center offers a diverse array of media, leadership, and educational programs. Without further delay, I'm handing the program over to Dr. Satu Limay. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Marilyn, and delighted to be here and great to work with our colleagues in Honolulu here from the Washington shop. Welcome to all who are participating from different time zones, different places, different times of their day. But welcome to you all. We have a great turnout for what I think is going to be a superb program because we have some superb speakers here, as Marilyn mentioned. I want to give you just a brief background to this report. The actual title of the report that will be released this coming week is A Hardening U.S.-China Competition, Asia Policy in America's 2020 Elections and Regional Responses. As the first part of the title suggests, key assessment is that the US-China competition is getting tougher, harder, more intense, however you want to frame that, and that this is the central Asia-related debate in the 2020 context. And we interviewed dozens of folks around the region, experts, specialists, government-related think tanks, to find out their views of this debate on our side as we move to the November 3rd elections. So we have, before going to the moderated discussion with our expert journalists located currently operating out of Delhi, Seoul, and Washington, who bring a Southeast Asia, South Asia, and a Northeast Asia perspective to this, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce my colleague who's worked for the second time. We did this report first in 2016, drawing on our tracker on the Asia Matters for America site, where we track all the social media and all the speeches of the various candidates through the primaries up through the general election. And drawing on those, as well as interviews and our own analysis and assessments, Bob Sutter has kindly agreed to be part of this the second time. I take that to be a good sign. And apart from his role, as Marilyn mentioned, at the Elliott School at George Washington University, I just want to flag for you the enormous experience he's had in the US government. I won't go through all his 22 books and 300 articles, but I will flag for you that he was a senior specialist on foreign affairs and national defense at the Congressional Research Service. He previously served as the National Intelligence Officer for East Asia and the Pacific at the US government's National Intelligence Council, and he led the China division at the Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. So this is a person, Bob Sutter, who brings not only extraordinary academic and intellectual prowess to these issues, but a deep experience in the US government. So with that, let me invite Bob to share some of the assessments of our report, and then we will engage in both moderated and open discussion. Bob, welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with this distinguished panel today. This is a wonderful opportunity for me, and I'm going to take a lot of notes and learn a lot from the group and also from the audience. My purpose today is to talk a little bit about the election campaign and how it dealt with Asia. And then I intend to talk a bit about how the hardening of the United States policy took place and the momentum behind it, because I think the momentum is actually very important in understanding where we're going to go from here. And then I'm going to try to summarize some of the findings that we found in our consultations with Asia. What do the specialists in these various parts of Asia think about this hardening in US-China relations, what it means for them, and also their issues with the United States also in that regard. So first, just a few points about the election debates. The debates, as far as the campaign were concerned, were heavily on the Democratic side. There wasn't any Republican debate or who was going to be their candidate. And the Democrats didn't talk about foreign policy very much at all. And they talked about Asia even less. And the only thing they really talked a lot about in Asia was about China, with a bit more, somewhat about North Korea. Other areas just were not discussed very much. There were lots of candidates, they had lots of discussions, but it was not a source of controversy. In fact, foreign policy, of course, is overshadowed in the United States by all these massive domestic issues that we have. But the one salient foreign policy issue is the US-China relationship. And that is something that's gotten worse during the campaign. And so we need to try to understand that. And so to do that, I think we need to just understand the drivers. And this is something that I've tried to follow carefully, and this is what I've seen. It developed in the Trump administration, in the first year of the administration, and we finally got some ideas about it, about where this was going, when they produced their national security strategy. That came out in December of 2017. That was a very hardline position against China. China was the #1 danger, and the main danger was economic. And they were on the brink, seen as on the brink of becoming the dominant power economically, particularly in high technology, which was be detrimental to American military prowess as well as economic situation. So this was a great sense of urgency shared by these people in the administration. And the most important thing to remember about this is that they were allied with and led by, at times, majorities in the Congress, Democrat and Republican. And this emerged in 2018. And we had a major law was passed in 2018. There were many others. But this was the National Defense Authorization Act in August of 2018, which made it a matter of law that the U.S. would have a whole of government pushback against Chinese challenges. And so this is the real beginning of it. And this is the momentum. It's inside the Beltway. It's just Washington centered, but it will emerge and spread. Mr. Trump himself doesn't speak in these terms. He doesn't talk in terms of his strategy. So he's different. But the senior leaders in the administration, and many others, and the majorities of the Democrats and majorities of the Republicans fully support this negative turn in American policy toward China. It developed in 2018 concurrently with the trade war that was taking place between Mr. Trump and the Chinese on various issues. They had a truce in the trade war in December, and then things simmered down. In 2019, the administration was less vocal about China, probably because of the trade negotiations. The Congress remained critical, but not nearly as effective or united. And the word was spreading to public opinion to some degree, but public opinion remained very ambivalent about China. And they didn't see it as this danger. They certainly didn't see it as an urgent danger. And so this didn't really change until the pandemic hit the United States in 2020. And here you find that gradually you'll find this sense of concern about China spreads to mainstream media, and public opinion then swings over and becomes very negative toward China, unprecedentedly negative in my professional lifetime. I've never seen anything like this. And so this is very strong. And that's the momentum that went into the campaign. Mr. Trump made China a major issue, and Mr. Biden responded by being much tougher toward China and criticizing Mr. Trump about China. And so that's where we are now, having this very harsh approach by the United States toward China. The drivers here continue, and the majorities of Congress, and both Republicans and Democrats, are supporting this policy. So whoever gets elected will face majorities in Congress, Republicans and Democrats, who have passed, I would think, about 40 laws on this issue. They're not about to back away from those laws, in my judgment. And so this, I think, is where the momentum is in the policy toward China. And now public opinion, which had been an obstacle, is no longer an obstacle, at least at this time. So that's the debate and why the hardening. Just a few points about the summary of what we learned from Asian countries and their specialists in Asian countries. First of all, this is a very high priority for most governments in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific. We went to India, as Satu indicated. We have done about 9 of these different exercises in 9 different places. The hardening of the competition creates a great deal of anxiety. The countries have to choose, and they don't want to choose. South Korea is really acute in the way it sees this rivalry. They're very worried about all of this, and it really complicates things for them on domestic politics in North Korea too. And then Japan also is conflicted about this approach. So some of these countries may see some benefit for them in a tactical way, but on balance, they are worried about the cost that they will encounter, the losses that they may encounter, and this type of concern is constantly registered. It's usually registered with some appreciation of a stronger, firmer American approach to China. That is welcome. But the way it's being done and the forced decisions on them and the possible costs of retaliation from China causes many of these governments to be very concerned. There are some governments that aren't nearly as concerned as others. For example, some of the Southeast Asian countries are really preoccupied with domestic affairs. So the U.S.-China relationship is important, but it's certainly not urgent importance. But most of the countries take a very strong view about this. There's expectation that this hardening is going to, it doesn't really have a clear end game. What is the goal of the United States pursuing this hard approach? That has not been made clear to these folks, at least it's not clear in their minds. And this makes them critical of the United States as well as being critical of China. And so this is another feature that we learned. There's a sense that, yes, this will be a durable feature going forward, that Mr. Biden or Mr. Trump, they do have proclivities to be moderate toward China for various reasons. They themselves may try to move in this direction, but there's a sense it'll be very hard for them to move given the context that I just described in the United States. And the idea in this regard is on the economic side is that this causes so many problems for these countries. Some, like India, some like Japan, like Vietnam, think they benefit to some degree by this hardening of U.S. approach, which leads to a certain amount of decoupling economically. But most are very concerned about the costs of decoupling for them, and they worry about this a lot. The one final point on the U.S.-China side is that they're worried about U.S. sustainability. They see all the turmoil in the United States, political divisions, all sorts of problems, and they say, is the U.S. up to this? Is the U.S. up to competing with China? Is the U.S. up to keeping the standards of its leadership in the region? I think they seriously questioning this going forward. Over the next couple of years, they'll be watching this very carefully, and they have been watching it already. And then meanwhile, the bilateral issues, and Satu will have something to add on this too, I'm sure, but the bilateral issues remain important for many of these countries. Bilateral with India and the United States, bilateral with Japan and Southeast Asian countries as well. So the bottom line here is that we have this momentum on the US side. It's very negative toward China. The end game of it is perceived as not very clear. It does grossly complicate the decision-making of these various Asian governments. Some of them feel it's advantageous to them. Some of them are more pro-US. Australia is obviously more pro-US, but they still worry about this situation and the trade-offs they face with the country like China. And so I think I'll stop there after this brief introduction, and I look forward to the comments and questions. And I guess my final point is that I think the two presidential candidates, if they are president, if they want to modify and ease tensions with China, they're going to have to justify it carefully inside the United States. This isn't going to be a given that you can say, oh, yes, let's just go back and be nice to China. That I don't think can happen politically inside the United States today. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to the next step in our session here.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. That's a terrific overview of as I said, the report that will be released later this week, early next week, just on the eve of the election. Those are the key findings, and we'll have more to say about them as we go. But now it's my absolute pleasure to turn to this distinguished group of journalists who've been covering these issues on the ground in various countries, including the US. And I would just go one by one and ask them to make some opening comments in response to what Bob has had to say about our report and their own findings as they're doing their work in reporting. And let me start with Mr. Nirmal Ghosh. Please, Nirmal.
Well, thank you for having me on. Namaste and mahalo. So as I was mentioning earlier, I've been to a few of the sort of critical states, and one of them was 3 days ago was North Carolina, and where I spoke specifically to Trump supporters, and I found that, of course, it's all very personality driven. You know, what one side of the political divide sees as outrageous and uncouth and graceless is seen as refreshing, and I think probably America's career politicians have themselves to blame for getting to this pass where people actually appreciate Donald Trump's way of doing things. Then when I, of course, coming from an Asian paper from a Singapore paper, the Straits Times, I asked them about foreign policy. And of course, foreign policy is a little lower on the priority. However, China is top of mind because of the pandemic. And of course, everyone refers to it as the China virus. They take their cue from the rhetoric. And I found a lot of appreciation for what President Trump has done with China. And they see President Trump as a leader with the courage, the guts to tell it like it is about China. And that sort of somewhat syncs with the outlook in Asia and Southeast Asia in particular, as Dr. Sutter said, and as the report goes into brilliant detail on. I think there's a certain appreciation for the fact that President Trump has articulated what many were reluctant to say out loud for one, because of diplomatic reasons. But President Trump is not diplomatic. So, he articulated all this, brought it out. And so there's a degree of appreciation for that, it is being said now. Of course, it lacks finesse, but there is also a perception that President Trump understands the use of power. And, international geopolitics is about power. Of course, we know that, America has tremendous soft power, but President Trump appears to be quite willing to threaten or actually use hard power. His striking Syria when when Bashar al-Assad had his forces use chemical weapons, that was seen as enforcing a red line. The U.S. stepped up phone ops in the South China Sea. That was appreciated. It's been appreciated to varying degrees, as Dr. Sutter mentioned. Some countries will wait against their own national interests, and some have are welcoming the U.S. pushback, the sort of whole of government pushback. Which has been the result of a fairly rigorous threat assessment, I think, and trying to catch up with maybe a lost decade when they lost sight of the fact that China was rising like this. But it also speaks to America's. I think the U.S. is another thing which Dr. Sutter said. I think the U.S.'s end game is not entirely clear. So you have a variety of responses in Southeast Asia. In particular, you have Vietnam, as Dr. Sutter said, sort of welcoming sort of partial decoupling of supply chains from China because Vietnam can benefit. Other countries in Southeast Asia, like Thailand, for example, at the moment are preoccupied with domestic issues. Other countries, sort of small and middle powers, Singapore, for example, they're interested in stability, but everybody does want the US to act as a sort of offshore balancer in Southeast Asia. But I think they are looking at, I think they would welcome a return to traditional diplomacy and a sort of multilateral approach and finding some areas where they can work with China, for example, on climate change. And that is the expectation of a Joe Biden administration, if Mr. Biden actually wins, that they will be look for some areas of cooperation: climate change, transnational organized crime, health, pandemics, basically transnational problems which will need global solutions. So they're looking forward to that. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, wonderful, Nirmal. Thanks so much for getting us started, both on what you're seeing on the ground here and responses, but also a bit on Southeast Asia. And we next turn to our colleague in India, who is the national political editor at the Hindustan Times, Ms. Sunitra Chowdhury, to give us a perspective from there. Sunitra, you're covering a number of issues, both national and international. We'd love to hear from you on this issue. Sunitra, are you with us? We can't hear you. Maybe you're on mute. You're on mute, I believe, Sunitra.
Sorry about that, Satyam.
No problem. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. As I speak with you, and it's very early morning over here, the newspapers haven't come in yet. But if they had come in, what I would be showing you is that the headline everywhere, what's front page news here everywhere is the visit by Pompeo and the defense secretary here in India. And just a day before, on Tuesday, what was the big news story over here was, of course, the signing of the agreement. And what everyone's talking about really, Satu, is the fact that look at the kind of relationship that we have built with India, that just a week before elections, we have the Secretary of State, the Defense Secretary, all coming down to India to sign a strategic deal. And by and large, Satu, what we are seeing is very kind of positive coverage of what this deal means. There are, of course, a few concerns that what it means for our traditional allies like Russia, our friends there, and the fact that you can expect some of the opposition parties, because India and America's relationship for quite some time now, especially in the Narendra Modi government, has always been traditionally had a huge kind of implication on domestic politics, always. But of late as well, it's as if we have the Bihar elections over here. So we have the, state elections. I think it wouldn't be wrong of me to say that we're looking at November 3rd elections as closely, they're happening around the same time, as closely as we're looking at the Bihar elections. So that's fascinating. And it's not just because of the fact that India, perhaps, everyone in America isn't so interested in international politics as we are. But it's just the fact that so much of India has figured in the debates that have been over there. Now, primarily, that's also because what's of concern to you right now, I think Bob Sutter's paper deals so much with China. And that seems to be our kind of priority number one right now as well. As you all know, for the last few months, what has been a major concern strategically for India is the fact that we've had the Chinese transgression over here, the situation along the line of control, and India's seriously worried about what this means and the fact that we haven't had the kind of disengagement or return to the old situation or old agreements that we've had with China. And so in that kind of atmosphere, the fact that Donald Trump speaks very tough on China comes as good news. So much so, Satu, that I think traditionally what we've all forgotten because of the kind of focus on what Trump is saying about China, we've all kind of were surprised by a reiteration by the recent surveys that came out that said that traditionally the Indian diaspora, which I'm told over and over again is 1% of your electorate, is primarily and traditionally been a Democrat supporter. But just because of the fact that there's been so much talk about and what Trump is saying about China, the kind of tough talking that he does fits in so much about what our government is saying about China as well. It makes us forget the fact that, that mostly Indians in the US have supported the Democrats and not the Republicans as much. I think the latest figures say that what Trump has done, of course, is the fact that that support, which was about 16% or so, has gone up to about 22%. But even that we forget it because so much of it has been overtaken by this kind of relationship and bonhomie that Narendra Modi and Donald Trump share as well. In fact, if you think about it, so many of us feel that part of the Republican campaign took place here in India in Gujarat, and right before India shut down for the pandemic, Trump was here. He was here, and I think India was the last country that he visited. Just to remind everyone, I was in the US, of course, covering the primaries, and Trump was in India, addressing what could only be described as a bit of an extended rally here in Gujarat. And of course, it became part of our campaign. The opposition used that to kind of attack Narendra Modi and say, look, along with just like Donald Trump is facing all those allegations of, the charges of being a super spreader, that campaign rally that took place in Gujarat, that kind of joint meeting between Trump and Modi was also something that the Congress party, the opposition here in India, said was a super spreader event before people knew about it, So it's interesting the kind of relationship and how crucial this entire election campaign has been. I think never before, just because of the fact that for 6 months we've had this situation with China. I think because of that, it almost feels like the election there are high stakes in it for India, because everyone's trying to guess, will Biden be easier on India or not? Because traditionally, of course, China and America with the Democratic government be kind of easier, and that perhaps makes people a little wary. So at the moment, they seem much happier with the kind of tough talking that Donald Trump has been done. What's also, of course, interesting is that if we look at the very recent past, the time that both candidates talked about India and China in the same breath, it was, of course, not very complimentary for us. We might have got the Becca agreement, but the last time that figured in the headlines here in India was the fact that Donald Trump mentioned us and China in the same breath as having, filthy air and pollution levels here in India, which, of course, I'll be honest, as a journalist, is bang on right. But it's not exactly what the government over here, especially with their kind of recent ties and intimacy that we've seen between the two leaders. We didn't want that. I'm sure they were very uncomfortable with that. But yes, that's something that we are perhaps going through the debate, your debates, as closely as the domestic, as Americans are, just because we're trying to figure out what this means, what the next White House dispensation will mean for us over here.
Well, wonderful, Sunetra, and I'm looking forward to following up with you on a couple of issues that you raised and that came up in our discussions with our Indian colleagues. But now we turn to Northeast Asia, where we have from NPR correspondent Anthony Kuhn, who has been reporting from Seoul and Tokyo and elsewhere in Northeast Asia in particular recently. Anthony, love to hear from you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to join the discussion. I'm speaking to you from my home office, which overlooks a US military base, which is in the process of emptying out as troops head south for a new facility called Camp Humphreys, which is basically the size of metropolitan Washington, D.C. And right next to that is the Korean War Museum. And yesterday I went there to observe a commemoration of the 70th anniversary of the Chosin Reservoir campaign, one of the key battles of that. So, a lot of my time here as a journalist is spent on US alliances in Asia. And, the US, all governments always make the point that that the US approach to Asia is based on alliances. And that leads me to think of two things. First of all, that is arguably problematic because the major power in the region, China, is not an ally. And if your strategy is based on the other countries, then that could cause some problems. The other is, of course, is that the alliances themselves are at this point under unprecedented stress, both from the inside and from the outside. From the outside, they're under stress, particularly from the increasing military capabilities of North Korea and China. And from inside, they've been under stress from an administration that has articulated a point of view that basically says, the best thing about alliances is that they have the possibility to generate cash flow. And if they don't, then we may rethink them. And also, I think a society that has not had a real discussion about what the US's goals are in Asia and what the country is willing to sacrifice or put on the line for them, a problem that has existed in previous crises, including the Vietnam War and the Korean conflict. I've been based in China, actually, for most of my career. And coming here a couple of years ago, it's clear that one of the biggest problems that the US faces is that, the US and its allies have fundamentally different views of China, the threat it poses, and what to do about it. From the South Korean point of view, there's been a bit of a kerfuffle over the ambassador to Washington, Lee Soo-hyuk, who was recently quoted as saying South Korea does not have to choose between the US and China, and if we did, we might not side with the US, which of course raised a lot of hackles in DC. The US answer to that was, you already chose when you became a democracy, end of story. Also, the US and South Korea recently held a security dialogue in which the resulting statement did not make a commitment to keep the troop presence at 28,500. And that's the first time that's happened. And I think South Korea is aware that there are going to be changes here. And even though there's a law right now that says that the US cannot draw down troops beyond a certain level without congressional consent, they're aware that the US military presence in Asia is set up to fight another Korean War, to send in troops through Japan, through the port of Busan, and up the peninsula, much as they did in 1950. And that may not be how it goes down. And so things are going to change. As I mentioned, troops are relocating to Camp Humphreys. When Donald Rumsfeld ordered that move in the 1990s, the North Koreans could not hit it with artillery. Now they can. They can hit anything, and Chinese missiles can go even farther. So basically, much of the US military real estate in Northeast Asia is at risk, and that presents all sorts of problems. On North Korea, we just saw at the beginning of this month, North Korea unveiling new strategic weapons, as Kim Jong-un promised, a new intercontinental ballistic missile, which theoretically can hit anything in the US, and a new submarine-launched ballistic missile, making it clear that, while he hasn't test launched anything, he's keeping his, Kim Jong-un is keeping his powder dry to see who he's dealing with after November. He's using the time to build up his military arsenal. I think either way, Kim Jong-un, although he's under great pressure from sanctions, probably feels that if it's Trump, then he can, there's still a chance that he can be manipulated to get the deal that North Korea wants. And if it's Biden, probably his Democratic advisors will tell him the only realistic option is to try to go for an arms control deal instead of the maximalist position of saying you must completely disarm before we give you anything. From the Japan side, we've just seen a transition to a new prime minister, Yoshihide Suga, who came to power promising to continue the policies of Shinzo Abe, which means a stronger military role in the region, and also helping the US to put together a sort of coalition of so-called like-minded nations, all while claiming not to aim this thing at China, which is highly problematic. And also, Japan will, Suga follows Abe, who built a very tight, superficially tight relationship with Donald Trump, which arguably helped him to avoid a sort of trade war with Washington of the sort that China is in, and also avoid the acrimony over the sharing of defense costs, which has really hurt the US-South Korean alliance. And so, finally in closing, I would just point some of the things that have been in the news lately. Particularly one is the Quad, which has been very high on the agenda since Pompeo made a trip out here. And Pompeo was the only person who talked about the threat of the Chinese Communist Party in a way that allies could not get on board with. There was no statement at the end. Japan Japan sees China as a serious threat, but not as much in the short term. And South Korea sees, just does not have the option of enraging China. And basically, for example, on the issue of 5G networks and technology, they say, look, that's a choice that our companies will make. We're not going to tell them to do that. And they've also made it clear that they see the Quad as excluding China, and they can't get involved in that. And one of the most interesting critiques of the Quad, and I'd love to hear my colleagues' thoughts on this, is that it's unrealistic to expect such a huge geographic coalition. It's impossible to ask countries in one region to get involved in another region on the US's behalf. So, for example, one would be surprised to see Japanese troops up along the line of control helping India with China, and perhaps also to see India get involved in the South China Sea or the East China Sea. I'd be interested to hear my colleagues' thoughts on that, and I'll leave it at there. Thank you.
Well, great, Anthony. Thanks so much. We are beginning to develop a queue of questions in the Q&A format, but we do have a few minutes, and I do want to, I rarely get an opportunity to ask journalists questions because as Nirmal and others know, they're usually contacting Bob or I for comments, especially in the lead up over the last few days to this election. So let me ask two big questions. And Anthony's last point about the Quad kind of is one, and we'll just have a couple of minutes, just if you have some thoughts. So both views of US and China in international surveys have gone down. Precipitously high increases of negative views of China, some decline in positive views of the US may be the way to frame it. In any case, both the US and China are not seen as particularly, good actors right now, responsible, reliable, predictable, useful actors. So I want to ask you, how much bandwidth is there in India, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, here we are focused on the US-China rivalry, but what if none of these countries particularly have a great deal of confidence in either of them? Are there any options in the region? ASEAN is weak, plenty of intra-Southeast Asian disputes. India lives in a very troubled neighborhood, has difficulties on both sides, and to the north with China. Japan and Korea's relations, whatever you could say about them, they're not getting better, and they're not getting better quickly, not to mention the China factor. So how much can we expect in this environment where US-China are at more and more intense rivalry or competition, but neither are particularly seen as reliable actors? What's the bandwidth for intra-Asian relations or sorting out difficulties within Asia? Or how do they manage this? So let me start with Sunetra this time. And maybe any thoughts on India? We just have, as I said, just a couple of minutes, and then we will go to Q&A, and then we'll come back and have more time for you guys to weigh in. Because I think the Quad issue is important. Please.
Well, and the Quad has made headlines here in the last few days as well, especially with the whole Malabar exercise and Australia coming in. So yes, India does look towards things to balance it out. And if we hear the internal kind of domestic concerns, Satu, it is the fact that are we relying too much on the fact? I mean, as I was saying, the whole Becca agreement may have got a lot of positive press right now, but there are concerns in saying, well, what are you doing strategically? Will India's interests always be aligned with the US's? And traditionally, it's always US is out there to have its own back, especially when you look at issues like trade and things like that. It's not that India has benefited from the kind of tariff, the tough tariff regime that Trump has put in. And so that's always been a kind of, criticism that people have had when we see the kind of increasing coziness between the two countries. What do we have? And that's been a concern as well. And as you rightly pointed out, the big thing about this government right now in its growing proximity with the US has been the fact that we haven't had exactly our traditional allies, especially in the neighborhood. We've seen problems with whether it's Nepal, whether it's Bhutan. They've all had concerns about the fact that, we have been kind of taking the big brother kind of attitude here in the region, and the Modi government has been too muscular for their own liking. And so these are things that they are working out, especially with the fact that, if we just talk about Becca, because it's really close on recall right now, our traditional alliance with something like Russia, which could perhaps help us in balancing that kind of thing, is definitely not going to be happy about what's happening over there. So yeah, it is something which perhaps the government has to answer, because they don't have the traditional Indian kind of foreign policy attitude, which has been of non-alignment, has been about the fact that you want to keep an arm's distance from all of these and kind of have your own path. But that's not something that India has been following recently, and this, what you're raising, is exactly that concern.
Thank you so much, Sunitra. Let's turn to Nirmal. How about Southeast Asia? I mean, ASEAN is seen as not terribly useful. People are going their own way in Southeast Asia. What do you do in this context where U.S.-China rivalry is hardening, but there's not confidence in either?
Yeah, I think to your direct question about whether there's bandwidth within Asia, I don't think there is. I mean, we've seen, if you look at South Asia just briefly, arrangements like SARC and BIMSTEC basically never got off the ground. I mean, no one even talks about them now. They sort of drifted away. ASEAN is somewhat split. Laos, as we know, has come under China's influence. Cambodia to a large degree. Thailand, because of Thailand is a long-standing U.S. ally, and there is a certain amount of trust and continuity in that. However, with the turmoil in Thailand right now, Thailand, after the 2014 coup d'etat, because of U.S. sanctions and whatnot, got closer to China, right? So yes, there are issues over there. But again, I would go back. I think President Trump's redefining of the U.S.-China relationship is his lasting legacy. He has shifted the ground decisively, and even if Joe Biden wins, his options are somewhat limited. Again, public opinion, as others have said, as you I think mentioned, or Dr. Sutter also mentioned, public opinion in the U.S. has turned sort of anti-China. It's anti-China in India as well, and the region has always been comfortable with the U.S. Although, I mean, they need the U.S., right? They need the U.S. as, like I said before, an offshore balancer. Because, but at the same time, they don't want the U.S. to overreach. They see China as overreaching somewhat, as overbearing. They welcome the U.S.'s tougher posture against China, but they don't want anything to go really seriously bad. They don't want a kinetic clash, for example, in the South China Sea or in the Straits of the Taiwan Straits, for example. I mean, and then the big question in Taiwan, of course, which is a whole other issue, is the U.S. going to go to war if China tries to take over Taiwan? That remains, somewhat doubtful. I mean, President Trump certainly does not want new foreign wars, and we know that, right? In terms of the Quad, I think the Quad is very interesting. It's more maritime oriented, right? I mean, from India's point of view, it's about denying, if push comes to shove, how to deny the Indian Ocean to Chinese shipping and naval assets and so forth. And India has sent a couple of ships now and then into the South China Sea. It has strategic links with Vietnam as well. So it is sort of making some moves, but it is far from, and is building up a little bit in the Andaman Islands, again to help in terms of the Indian Ocean. But beyond that, I think the U.S. is still seen as an essential part of the whole equation. I mean, if the U.S. Withdraws from the region, and there's been much concern over its withdrawal from multilateral arrangements, starting, of course, with the TPP, and if you go further west, the JCPOA and so forth, as the question was raised earlier about, this raises the issue of U.S. reliability. Will the U.S. stick to its commitments? And the Philippines is one. Philippines is one area as a treaty ally, but what happens if there's a kinetic clash between Chinese naval assets and the Filipino Navy? Will the U.S. step in? We still don't know. right? Although Secretary Pompeo has said yes, I mean, this is he has sort of reinforced and supported the Mutual Defense Treaty. We still don't know that, and there are a lot of people who hope that we are not sort of placed in that position, right? But yeah, I think the US is still required as an offshore balancer, but how long it stays there with the decreasing American appetite in the American public for foreign wars, foreign involvements. We've seen what happens when the US withdraws. You see what's happening in Afghanistan. I mean, the Taliban who have been released from jail as part of the agreement have returned to the battlefield.
Right.
So I mean, there's serious questions as to what happens in Afghanistan. But anyway, I'll stop there and leave it.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't mean to rush you, but I want to just give Anthony just a minute because I do want to turn to some interesting Q&A that is coming through and make sure that we get our participants in. Please, Anthony, on the Quad. And also
let me just
sort of Northeast Asian prospects for cooperation.
Well, I think, what I want to talk about is, as you said, the reliability of the big powers. I think the US's big allies, Japan and South Korea, are worried about what I would call a strategic default in which the US is unable to meet its obligations, in which its credibility crumbles. And for this reason, the allies are all pursuing their own independent capabilities, particularly building up their militaries. But I think the other interesting possibility is related to inter-Asian cooperation, and that is that the two main powers duking it out may create space for middle powers, if you like, to play a bigger role. For South Korea, that would be in something like public health, like sharing its experiences in tackling COVID. Mm-hmm. For Japan, it may be something like building infrastructure around the world, which has been fantastic at. If people want to see some competition for China's Belt and Road Initiative, Japan has been amazing at economic diplomacy, building subways in Jakarta and infrastructure all over the place in a very competitive way. So this may open up more room for them.
Well, fascinating, really good. And we'll come back to it. But as I said, part of my obligation is to make sure we get some audience questions in. So let me turn to those and I'll try to bring you all in. And please bear with me. I'm reading a whole set of them and I'm going to try to crunch a couple together when they are on a particular issue or a country, because otherwise it's going to be difficult for me. Okay, so the first question we had was about was directly addressed to Sutter, Professor Sutter, but others can weigh in too if you really have something to say on it. And that's from our president, Dr. Richard Volstek at the East-West Center, asked about Xi Jinping thought and his desire to implement a more aggressive international role. How do you see this as a driver?
I think it's common to see Xi Jinping as more assertive than the other Chinese leaders of the past. We're really in a new era. And there's a debate on how much his ambitions are, how far does he want to take the China dream. And some people, many people now say he's priming China to be a global leader. And of course, in the high-tech area, there's a great worry that China's going to be dominant in that area, and that would give them a true global leadership. And so this is something that is widely worried. I am an evidence-based analyst. I sort of plod along, trying to understand what's going on. And what I see is that China wants to advance, and they want to do it on their terms, and they're very adamant about it. And we're in the way. The United States, its allies, its partners, and the order that we represent is in the way. And they want that changed. And they do it in various ways. They challenge it, they undermine it, they outmaneuver it, and they confront it. But this happens all over in every foreign policy arena. This happens, and so it's been going on for several years, and it's getting worse. And so so I'm not sure China wants to dominate the world, but boy, it sure is a pain in the neck to the United States in a whole range of areas.
Well, that's good, but I want to bring our journalist colleagues in on this because it really was one of the other questions I had for them in the moderated discussion, but couldn't get to. And that's this whole economic picture. I mean, in the context of the health COVID-19 pandemic, obviously economic recovery is a priority for every country, whether it's Washington, the United States or China or any other country. How far, and we asked this a lot in our report, Bob Sutter and I in our interviews asked a lot about this. Yes, China wants to do this. They want it on their own terms. They want to push, they want to create, they want to set the rules, norms. How much is the countries of the region willing to go along because they share those same concerns? They may not frame them exactly like we do, but civil military fusion. But Anthony, Korea has been very much leading protection of its competitive edge because it doesn't want China to get the competitive edge in areas where Samsung, digital, screens. So they're protecting their technology. They're worried about theft of intellectual property. And as the court cases in Korea show, this has been the case in Singapore on core parts of the telecom sector for Singapore. In India, has led the way on banning Chinese apps. So what can we expect? Sure, they want to get the benefits of trade and economic relations with a rising China, but they're also seen very guarded and more so. What do you guys sense is the bandwidth of what Bob is saying about Chinese assertiveness in this space? Anthony, you want to go first?
Sure. I think in the short term, everybody here in the region feels that China has got to be the key to the recovery from COVID. Trade with China is absolutely crucial. If you're North Korea, then it's existential. So everybody's watching to see when that border reopens and trade resumes. But I think all the countries in the region, particularly Japan and South Korea, are long-term looking to diversify their manufacturing out of China to Southeast Asia and other places. Both Japan and South Korea have a so-called Southern policy. Yoshihide Suga's first trip in office was to Vietnam and Indonesia. Whether or not the US has encouraged them, they've already had a plan to subsidize this move out of China to other countries, although not mentioning China by name. But it's a long-term thing. As we all know, China's manufacturing capacity and its infrastructure are so far beyond other countries. It's going to take a long time. But as China's labor costs increase, as it moves up the value-added chain, it's going to happen. It just is not going to happen all at once.
I'm sorry, Nirmal, would you like to make any comments on this issue?
Yeah, just a brief comment. It's interesting about the sort of other powers in the region which are often neglected, which are seen sort of within the prism of US-China relationship or as merely as US allies. If you look at Myanmar, the big competition for China in terms of investing in Myanmar infrastructure and whatnot is Japan. Japan has been has had a very despite the history of the Second World War is all basically gone, and Japan has a very positive reputation in the region, and Japan is the main competitor across, I would say, even across the region to China and America, of course. But in terms of Asian powers, it is really Japan, and I think that is something which is somewhat neglected and undercovered. Japan's influence in the region as a major investor and developer and a competitor to China. So just a quick observation.
No, I think that's important, and we should flag that while U.S. and China, attitudes towards U.S. and China have declined across the region, and trust levels, particularly in Southeast Asia for China, are at 78 and 84% on economic and politics. I may have the exact details wrong, but roughly. And anti-China sentiment gets more pronounced as you move to mainland Southeast Asia. Japan is at roughly 75% favorability ratings in the region, has the highest trust and most likely seen to be doing the right thing. And materially, its implementation rates on infrastructure throughout Asia are roughly 70%. meaning that the competition on infrastructure is not between the US and China. It is not. We compete in many other ways. The United States does wonderful things in a number of other ways, but it ain't on infrastructure. It's between Japan and China. And Japan is far ahead. And it's, I mean, India, we'll turn now to Sunitra if she has any thoughts on this. If you don't, that's okay. We can bring you back into the next, but I want to give you a chance because Japan has huge projects in India, special economic zones, the metro, I mean, all kinds of things. And they're slogging away at, if I may say very frankly, it has been a tough slog for them on these big infrastructure projects in India.
Definitely. Japan has been a really close ally that way. It's someone that we turn to as well. But Satu, I don't know if it's in the context on if it's any competition to the kind of economic relationship that India and China and the kind of impact of these worsening relations can really be compared with what's with that of Japan, because it's, you know, since the kind of worsening of relations with China, one of the key things that India has focused on is how to, you know, there's been a kind of rallying cry for self-reliance. And while there's a huge kind of thing, you know, for example, one of the things that we, you know, Diwali's coming up and it's festive season, one of the big things has been Chinese toys. And it's forced India to come up with, and we're about to announce, you know, how to kind of develop our own toy industry, because we're so kind of reliant on things coming in from China. And India keeps announcing, in the whole wake of this, India keeps announcing how imports from China have gone down, but it's only in key areas. So it's something economically which is impacting us a lot. So it has huge repercussions. And as I said before, one of the things that when Trump started talking tough about it is that it would be benefit at all. And that kind of benefit we haven't seen from the US with its changing dynamic with China, but it's something that we are coping in our own right as well. I mean, just like America, the whole TikTok, WeChat, everything, all Chinese apps have been banned over here. And one of the things, one of the major initiatives that is on in India right now is to come up with alternatives domestically to such popular apps, because they have, you know, they're extremely popular here in India. So that's something that we are kind of dealing with right now.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. But Sunitra, I would note that the last time I looked at these figures for venture capital for app development in the high-tech sector in India, approximately 8 billion of that was coming from China to finance the development of Indian apps. So if you're going to ban it, if the Indians are going to ban Chinese apps, my hunch is there's not going to be any VC capital flowing into India to develop Indian apps as well. Look, I want to use the moderator's prerogative here to stay on this economic theme, because there are a number of questions in our queue about this thread of economics, which I think is really important. One question, a couple of people have raised this in different ways, is what do you expect on the TPP? Does the region expect a Biden administration to sort of revisit that, renegotiate, put a different label on it? Mr. Trump never took the opportunity, the president never took the opportunity to call it the Trump partnership. So that wasn't an option. So would he, if he comes back, would he relabel it? And now that he has the USMCA, which drew from the TPP, would he try to do it again? What's your thinking on TPP? Because that flows into this and quite related to this. And it was a question about, if this decoupling happens, we can expect inshoring, if some inshoring happens back to the US or even regional countries, since you're all out, some of you are out there, it's going to raise prices, right? So will that occasion a rethink about decoupling? Might the American public, this person, Jason Lim asks, might decoupling and moving production plants back to the US give rise to protest by the American public to rethink this stance? Because likely costs are going to be higher if you use the US as a production base. Any thoughts on that? Maybe who'd like to start on that TPP/inshoring? Nirmal, please.
I could pitch in for a second. I think the hope in the region is that the US will rejoin the TPP. But if President Trump wins re-election, he will only rejoin if he renegotiates it to his advantage, right? If Joe Biden wins, then he still has to contend with a wide swath of public opinion in the US, which is against these kinds of arrangements, right? So he will also have to some degree, put conditions on the US returning to the TPP. In terms of reshoring to the US or other places, that's a good question. And I read somewhere, I can't remember, that actually, although there has been relocation of supply chains to some degree, it's actually been very small. A very tiny percentage even of American companies have actually exited China, a very tiny percentage. And let's face it, that's how the economic system works, right? I mean, you can be as patriotic as you want, but then when you can't make your product at a competitive market price, there's a limit to how much you are going to, inconvenience yourself and endanger your own market position. That's just a quick comment.
Anyone else? Bob, Anthony, Sunetra? Anyone else want to make any comments on outlook on TPP? No? Okay, so then let me turn to, so now we have some country-specific questions. So if you have something to say about this country, I welcome your thoughts, because some of these, Bob, were covered in our report. One is on Singapore. Specific question for Mr. Ghosh, but Bob, I think your input, since we did the interviews there, would be useful too. For Singapore, in terms of their stance on US-China tensions, Singapore is the largest foreign investor in China since 2013, and the USA is the largest foreign investor for Singapore. China is also Singapore's largest trading partner. Do you think there is a chance for Singapore to lean slightly towards either nation should tensions escalate? How would the island nation respond? Probably I would ask Nirmal and Bob to weigh in on this. Bob, maybe you can kick us off.
Let me say something about what we learned in our discussions. And it seemed to be the Singapore opinion seemed to be slightly weighted in favor of the United States in this competition. Not that Singapore wants to take sides or anything like that, and they have a very healthy respect for China's power and the influence and the pressures that they are on the receiving end from China whenever they get close to the United States. But at the end of the day, they keep their stake with the United States. They expanded the U.S. The length of time now is about 50 more years for the U.S. military presence in Singapore, and other indications of their close relationship with the United States mentioned in our discussions. So it's what do they call it? Was it a weighted equilibrium? I think is the way they put it. And the weighted equilibrium was in favor of the United States. But that's very carefully done. And Singapore is not a country that I would count as aligning with the United States in that sense. They want to have a close relationship with the United States, and they do things together, and they're concerned about China, but they don't want to get into trouble with China either.
Nirmal, do you have any comments on this comment?
No, not really. I think Dr. Sattar put it very well, and I would just concur with everything he said. And just one additional comment is that Singapore generally sort of favors a multilateral approach. So if the U.S. administration somewhat, re-engages in multilateral arrangements and institutions like the WHO, for example, I think that would be generally welcomed. But otherwise, I think Dr. Sattar put it very well.
Yeah, I think that I would just add to that, one of the takeaways I had for all countries, we've framed it in the US, China, and it's certainly the dominant thing. But, for a lot of countries, the international system matters a lot. It's not only the power of, it's not just this geopolitical middle power space, but small countries like Singapore require a WTO rules-based system to operate internationally. Japan talked a lot about needing layers of the international system in order to be able to navigate. So does India. India has a huge role in multilateral institutions in the UN. Not always comfortable in the US-India relationship, I might add. they've been quite complex relations and negotiations between the US and India. But they're very important to their way of operating in the international system. So I think that's a good point. Another question that came up that we haven't touched on, but I think is important, is about sort of soft power in Chinese behavior. And this questioner, Roger Baker, thinks, in thinking about soft power and perceptions of Chinese behavior in the region, are there exceptions of either softening Chinese positions mid next year in anticipation of hosting the Winter 2022 Winter Olympics to regain some lost ground in public opinion? Or contrarily, an increase in tensions as international tensions is heightened against Chinese social human rights and ethnic rights issues? And another person asks about the whole issue of human rights going forward in the US-Asia relationship. There's many people perceive the Trump administration as not having prioritized that issue. And that many expect that a Biden administration, if elected, would place more emphasis on this issue. What do you guys think? Because this will create some dynamics in our relations with all of the countries that you cover or are in. Sumitra, please.
Yes, this is actually a very key question for India. And in fact, this may perhaps be at the root of why India is a little uncertain about having the Democrats back in the White House. Let's not forget, just a few months ago, it was, a Democratic representative, Pramila Jayapal, who raised a very uncomfortable question about what's happening in Kashmir. Kashmir and, the kind of abrogation of Article 370 last year has been something that the Indian government is something, it was key on their agenda. They did it, and they did not want any kind of international interference in that, any questions raised about it. But of course, this has been something which has been all round completely panned and condemned internationally by human rights groups, whether it's Amnesty. And India has faced a lot of scrutiny by the fact that Amnesty has had to recently shut shop over here and leave India. So these are the kind of concerns about human rights which India is perhaps wary about the US asking. And what's happening right now is that the Trump administration hasn't been asking those questions, which suits the government fine. And what they're wary about is if you have Biden coming in, especially because of the fact that it's been a lot of the Democratic representatives who've been asking about Kashmir. I think it was even the Squad, I think even AOC and others raised the question of what's happening in Kashmir and human rights, especially by the fact that, there was shutdown much before all of us came to understand shutdowns. You had the entire valley cut off. They didn't have any internet connection for months. They didn't have phone connection for a long time as well. And these were questions that the international community and human rights groups were asking. And these are questions that India wants to tell the US that it's none of your business. You shouldn't be asking us these questions. And they're worried that it's going to be difficult to ignore if Biden is in the White House. So yes, this is a major, major concern. And I think it's a concern that domestically in the US people would have about China, but these are concerns which perhaps India shares as well, that it comes too close to the bone. And it's something that India is perhaps going to be really worried about, because at the moment, the US's concerns about China fit in very, very comfortably with us. But when it comes to Kashmir, it's going to be something that India is not going to be comfortable with.
Well, thank you very much. Others, Bob, Nirmal, Anthony, yes, please. Yes, please.
Just a couple of quick points. This has been a year in which China has been, in the sort of mainstream media narrative, has been seen as undermining its own soft power with its policy towards Uyghurs in Xinjiang, with the national security law in Hong Kong. But I want to point out that it's important to also look at non-Western nations of the developing world, in which China, I think, remains a success story in where its economic development and its governance and all have, still have significant soft power. We can't just look at the Western nations, which see China's efforts on the world stage and aspirations to global leadership is extremely ham-fisted. The other point is, I think that to many countries, whether it's developing nations or developed long-term allies, I think they all just feel that, if the US feels threatened by things like, China's bid to become a leader in advanced technologies like Made in China 2025, well, then invest in your own R&D, invest in your own crumbling infrastructure, do something about your health care costs rather than trying to discredit and undermine competitor China.
Anthony, I just comment on one thing. I was really taken by this IC survey. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it, where, again, I'm going to use round numbers because I don't remember off the top of my head the exact. 70+% of Southeast Asian elites believe that the most political and security influence in the region would be by China. And even a higher percentage, 75+, thought that China would be the biggest economic actor, which we've been discussing here. But higher percentages than expected China's dominance in those areas, both hard and soft power, were negative about China achieving that, which I thought was really quite extraordinary, because whatever dissatisfaction there is about the US, there's a request for more US, not less US. And that's kind of inverse of China. We worry that China is getting, well, we note that China is getting, or we expect China to be getting more powerful, but we're very ambivalent and very anxious about it. How do we accord for this in the soft power dynamic at play in a hardened US-China competition? The complaint about the US is, we don't have enough of you, not that we have too much. In China's case, there seems to be, whoa, how do we deal with this in the region?
I think that sort of reflects the geographical proximity of China, doesn't it? I mean, that's not going to go away. It cannot go away. So it just reflects geographical proximity, which creates this dilemma or tension, and it just reflects that.
Okay, yeah, I asked because it continues to come up, and the geographical answer always comes up, Nirmal, and my response to always is, the US has a presence of almost 150,000 troops in the region. And the demand is for more credibility and reliability and capacity of that presence, even if we're not, quote, geographic. We're actually, as I always say, we're in the region. We're not out.
The US is a Pacific power.
So I'm always puzzled by this, and it comes up in our queries here about soft power and balance. But anyway, I don't want to belabor it. I note it. Bob, did you want to come?
Yeah, just a point on Chinese soft power, and what we've seen in developed countries in China's soft power, that it's a double-edged sword, because it comes with sharp power. You see the Chinese trying to control things. You see them using leverage all the time. If you have close economic leverage, and how the Chinese use it is very blatant in dealing with various countries. And so the soft power of an attractive economic model, of a rising power trade, and this type of thing, and a lot of these soft power initiatives that the Chinese carry out come in tandem with the intellectual property theft, trying to control media, trying to elite capture. It comes in Australia and New Zealand are case studies of this, but Singapore gets a lot of this. Taiwan gets a lot of it, of course. But I think it's not so prevalent elsewhere, where the countries don't disagree with China. But if you disagree, boy, you get the heat. And I think that happens with various countries, and they see it, and I think they don't like it, and that's certainly the case in Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, and I think it's and Singapore, and I think it's something that is in other places. I think Anthony Kuhn's remarks about other countries, developing countries, seeing China's model, I agree with that completely. And authoritarian governments there, they like the Chinese model in that sense, so it works well. But countries that want to keep their own power and not be under the thumb of China. I think they worry about this kind of practice. Underneath, they try to control, and it's very strong in many cases.
All right, I'm afraid we now are at the stage in this program with 10 minutes to go where I have to do a little lightning round. So I'm going to combine a couple of things and try to, one is 3 countries have come up, one of which we did not cover in our report simply for time and space reasons. And those 3 countries that people have questions, I won't go into, some of them are quite long questions, but basically, where is the US-Thai relationship? Where is the US-Malaysia relationship? And where is the US-Bangladesh relationship? If anyone would like to make any comments on those, I'd welcome. Bob, we did talk to our Malaysian counterparts and our Thai counterparts a bit anyway. So maybe you could offer, maybe if Nirmal and maybe Sunitra, if you wanted to say something about Bangladesh, I don't know. But Bob, why don't you kick us off?
Hey, on the Thai relationship, I think the sense that we got was that Thailand does want to keep the alliance relationship with the United States, but they're clearly moving closer to China on a whole range of reasons. And as was shown, I think several of our group have made this point that Thailand is very preoccupied. It's got enormous domestic problems and with the virus and just staying in power in the face of demonstrations. And so China is much more important for them. They want to get vaccines from China. They want to get trade and economic relationships to help them get out of their economic situation, which is very bad. And so the U.S. doesn't play in those areas very well. And so yes, they want to keep the alliance, but clearly the activity and the movement is part of improving their relationship with China. Malaysia is, I mean, it's pretty clear what they've been doing. This is public, but the foreign minister, when the U.S. took the initiative to send these ships to face off with the Chinese ships that were intimidating the Malaysian ships, the Malaysian foreign minister didn't want them to do that, and he publicly made that clear. And he made it, and so that's where they stand. They feel they can handle China without this kind of a pushback from the United States. So it's very different than Vietnam and other places that welcome this kind of show of force in the United States. They don't seem to want that South China Sea. And they're very balanced in how they deal with this issue, but low profile on the U.S. and much higher profile in how they deal with China. On Bangladesh, I don't have much data in that.
Anyone else want to come in on these? Okay, otherwise there are a couple more questions. We talked about TPP, but Professor Peter Petrie, who has been a long time adjunct fellow at the East-West Center and is head of the economics department previously at Brandeis University, done as a eminent trade economist, asked about the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. We talked about TPP, but there's this 10 member effort out in the region, a 10 plus 6, whatever it is now. India's decided not to go forward with it. Where are we on that? Anyone have thoughts on where that is? Japan is involved, Korea is involved, China is involved. So all of it covers all your regions really. So anybody have any intel on where RCEP is going? Anthony, do you have thoughts on this from Korea?
Yeah, I'll just mention briefly that yes, South Korea and Japan are quite interested in RCEP, RCEP. They're not put off by the fact that it's basically an initiative put forth by China. And I think it's also really important to look what happened with the TPP, and that is that after the Trump administration pulled out, the other countries led by Japan just went ahead and with the TPP deal and closed it. And that means that all their trading partners, got relief on tariffs. And what the US had to do was basically renegotiate the whole thing and get the deals that they would have gotten had they stayed in the first place. And this was, of course, driven by American farmers and manufacturers. And so if the US is left out of these deals, there's going to be pressure on whichever administration comes in to do something about it.
Anyone else on this issue? Otherwise, we'll pick up a couple of other issues. So one issue that came out, and for Sunitra, you did speak about this, but in a nutshell, Has the U.S.-India relationship, someone asks about Mr. Pompeo's and Mr. Esper's visit for the 2+2, has this really changed the relationship? Are we on a transformative trajectory in the U.S.-India relationship?
Well, just the fact that in the last few months, as I said, we've seen a lot of bonhomie, but I think that as many other experts, I was reading Dr. Amitabh Mattu's piece recently and other experts, whether it's Raja Mohan, everyone else, that the India-US relationship has always been on an even keel. And that's what people point out as well, that while it looks like Trump and Modi are extremely close right now, but we shouldn't forget perhaps that before that, Barack Obama also came into India. He made a couple of visits over there. They were on first name terms, which was of, great kind of, a lot of articles were written about that as well. And so on the whole, whether it's a Democrat in the White House or the Republican, India has had a kind of even keel of relationship with the White House. So, it's been more or less, there have been, of course, what also came out recently is the fact that, when it was Nixon in the White House, then things were particularly bad, especially by what was happening in Bangladesh, the whole kind of situation over there. And Indira Gandhi, of course, went to the US and gave it back to the Nixon administration. But apart from those kind of low points, and of course, there were concerns when India also tested its nuclear weapon in '98 as well during the Vajpayee administration. But after that, post that, we saw an evening out. And I think Dr. Manmohan Singh perhaps marked that change. If we talk about the change, it's not happening right now with the Trump administration, but I think it would be the George Bush administration, which really saw the kind of turnaround happen post the Cold War and other things. The kind of India-US relationship, I think if the turnaround happened and, it was more during Bush's time rather than the Trump administration.
Right, we are 3 minutes from the close, so I know that I can't get to the additional questions that are there, but it is important for me to end on time so that we can give people a start to their day in Asia, and we can close up the day here on the East Coast. I know it's approaching 10:30 p.m. our time, but I want to just ask you quick lightning round for last comments about the 2020 election. I'm not going to ask you who's going to win, but I am going to ask you if you had to name one thing to watch for in the US-Asia relationship going forward, regardless of who wins, from the vantage points that you're looking at it in the region, what is it? Anthony?
I'm quite focused right now on the military aspect, and I feel that the U.S.'s allies, the critical ones anyway, feel that the U.S. does not have the answer to China's rise. And on the military side, that it's just, the U.S. military admits that it is outpositioned, outmaneuvered, is at a disadvantage, and that China has the initiative. So I will be looking to see whether either administration, comes up with a rethink of its position, and as I said earlier, puts this issue to the U.S. public. What are our commitments and our goals, and what are we willing to pay for it?
I think this is going to be a real big debate in U.S. policy: is what are we willing to do in the region, and for whom, and under what conditions. I completely agree with you. So thank you. I think that's a real good issue. And I hope we can talk about the Quad another time, because I've been working on the Quad and would love to get your feedback from Northeast Asia, because Korea is not in the Quad and has been skeptical. Nirmal, thought for you on sort of, what are you watching for here? You're covering it from the US, but you're from the region, working for a Singapore paper. What's the big takeaway here?
Basically, again, of course, as you said, the $64 million question is who wins. Now, if Donald Trump wins re-election, there's a high possibility that he will eventually pull out troops from South Korea and from Japan, right? A lot of people I've spoken to in the region think that that means inevitably South Korea and Japan will sort of embrace nuclearization, nuclear weapons at some point in the future, right? Because it leaves every person for every country for itself. So that is one thing. The North Korea question will persist. How will they tackle whoever gets into power? How will they tackle North Korea? Right? North Korea, to a certain degree, Kim Jong-un, North Korea has been legitimized by President Trump, and he touts it as a foreign policy win because he said, we would have been at war if I hadn't done that. But I mean, at the same time, North Korea has not done much to denuclearize at all. It's not showing any signs of that at all. But it hasn't launched, it hasn't done ICBM tests and whatnot. So I think much depends on who wins. I think if Joe Biden wins, the status quo will remain to some degree. But the U.S.-China relationship is the big one to watch going forward.
Thank you so much. I'll have Bob do the last word on this. Sunitra, any sort of big issue that you're seeing?
I mean, the big issue for us is the big issue for you, Satu, and is sitting there in DC, is basically what both candidates, what both dispensations, what is their take going to be on China and our kind of standoff that we've seen for almost 6 months right now along the line of control. And while we know what Donald Trump's take is, and as I said, the kind of comments that Mike Pompeo has made during his visits in India, I think the big uncertain thing is how, if Kamala Harris, and of course, her connection with India is very well known, has been written about so much, and Joe Biden, what they do and what their take is on China and the India-China situation over there. So that's really the thing to look out for. Everyone, of course, says that, if they do much more of a balancing act, if the Democrats do a much more of a balancing act, that's not something that India is going to be very happy with. But that's really the key thing to look out for. That's the only kind of mystery right now, that if they come in, and traditionally it says, and they're up ahead in the polls, and that's what the Indian diaspora also always favors. But if they come in, what does it really mean for us and China?
That's bigger than H-1B visas, is it, in India right now?
You reminded us.
I couldn't resist.
I know, I had it down in my notes that the only kind of time. Actually, that brings up another point. The only kind of, I had put down over there, what are the kind of cons which the government right now feels in the Trump administration? H-1B, you said it. Sure. Yes, that's a huge concern. Sure. And the other thing is the constant offers of mediation with Pakistan. That's something that, that's something that keeps popping up as well. And it's something that Narendra Modi and his government, they do not appreciate.
Sure. Thanks. Bob, why don't you close us off with kind of how you see this with our findings of the report?
Well, this is great. And I think the driver is in the United States or on China. The key one I'm watching is this high technology competition. This is something that I think is just, this is real. And it's very important for DRD. It's very important for national security overall. And it's very important for U.S. economic leadership. And so the U.S. is going to do things that I think they're going to sustain this, and it makes the U.S. feel very vulnerable. And so I think this is something to watch carefully. If the U.S. stops doing this, then you're going to look at a very different approach to China, it seems to me. And that will be offshore balancing. It'll be a lot of accommodation of China, and that will be alarming to people in Asia. So I think I would definitely watch this competition and the intensity of the American willingness to compete with China in the high technology arena. I think it's going forward.
Well, thank you all. And I just want to say our report is forthcoming, the final version of it. I know you saw a draft, and I'm really appreciative of you guys, particularly our journalist friends, taking time. And of course, my co-author and colleague, Bob Sutter, for participating again in this project. Please take a look at the Asia Matters for America website, including the tracker, which is going to close up here after November 3rd, but it gives you a lot of the tweets and a lot of the information. I'm not sure who that is on the line, but in any case, welcome. And now it gives me great pleasure to thank Susan Kreifels, Marilyn Lee, and all my colleagues in the wonderful place of Honolulu for cooperating on this program with us. It was just a great delight to be part of your East West Center live stream seminars program. So over to you, Marilyn. Thanks so much.
Thank you again so much to our distinguished speakers and moderator today for sharing their insights and expertise and perspective. And Dr. Bob Shutter, Dr. Nimal Ghosh, Mr. Nitra Kauturi, Mr. Anthony Kuhn, and Dr. Satu Limei. The center is delighted to have played host to such an engaging and interesting discussion. Thank you as well to our viewers for attending this East West Center Seminars Live webinar. Last but not least, many thanks to the Straits Times for supporting this event and sharing program information with their members. Finally, please tune in on our next webinar in November. The announcement and registration is coming soon. To everyone, mahalo and aloha. Thank you. Thank you all.
Good night, everyone. Good morning. Good day.